only do this when you observe your thoughts. You cannot be the thinker if you're both observing the thoughts at the same time. And so we achieve this state of observation through a skill known as metacognition. Metacognition refers to the act of observing the activities of your mind. And it's metacognition which creates separation from this rushing river of mental noise. Instead of being the thinker that is lost inside it and therefore being influenced by your thoughts, you are now standing on the riverbed or the river bank, and you're now watching your thoughts go past. And as you become the observer of your thoughts, you create separation from them. There's this quote from Viktor Frankl: between stimulus and response lies your power. It's your power to choose how you want to respond. When you're the thinker identified with your thoughts, you don't have a choice. If you think something, that's what's happening. And that's what you think. And so you behave in alignment with that thought. But with metacognition, you create separation from this rushing river. And therefore, you regain the ability to choose how you want to respond and the types of actions that you want to take, liberating your ability to create new outcomes, escape this loop of 90% of the same thoughts. And the process here is simple. So we've got a protocol we can run through here in terms of how to interrupt and replace your thoughts. And again, you need to ask yourself, what would the version of me for whom the goal is inevitable, what would they think on a daily basis? How would they speak to themselves? And that's the way we want to interrupt. So the first stage is interruption. You need to catch yourself in this automatic negative thought spiral the moment it occurs, right? What you'll notice is how often you're distracted by your own thoughts, and you'll get better and better at catching them the more metacognitive you are. And metacognition is something you train through Vipassana meditation. It's something I've spoken about at length in other lessons if you want to seek that out and learn a bit more about that. The second step is replacement. Now, once you've interrupted the thought, we do have the ability to conjure up unique thoughts. So we don't have the ability to control our thoughts. They're just coming at us, but we can add a couple new thoughts into that river. And so you swap whatever negative catastrophization or visualization you are running for a positive version. This is not aimless sort of positive thinking. We go through a very specific protocol here. It's called WHOOP. And this is from a scientist called Gabrielle Oettingen. I don't know if I mispronounced the name there, but she's done a lot of research on visualization. And there's a really good insight here, not exactly relevant to this, but I think you should know, which is anybody who's talking about visualizing the outcome, assuming that you've already achieved the goal and feeling the goal as if it's already been achieved, there is very compelling scientific evidence to suggest that that sort of visualization of the outcome reduces your allostatic load, which reduces your motivation to take action. And so that type of visualization alone is fairly ineffective. The type of visualization you want to follow follows the structure of wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. Okay, so the wish and outcome is visualizing the outcome and then you achieving it. But the crucial point here is you need to visualize the process, the actions that get you there. And you don't want to visualize it all going well and picture everything going swimmingly, because of course it won't. It's not going to be a walk in the park. And so the crucial point here is anticipating friction. And based on that friction, setting an implementation intention. An implementation intention is a fancy psychological word for if X happens, then I will do Y. If this thing that will probably go wrong, if it does go wrong, I will do this thing. And you visualize these intentions, you overcoming the adversity, the resistance. And you do this on a loop. You keep going through different bouts of adversity. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a formal practice that you do every single day. You can just notice yourself getting lost in your own mind throughout the day, and you interrupt it and you replace it with a form of positive visualization where you actually you go through the outcome that you want, you create a positive expectation effect, a positive placebo effect, but you don't just fantasize about it. You actually visualize and picture the plan and something going wrong and overcoming it. That's the idea. And what we're doing here is killing the looping narrative that your old self is clinging onto, and it's running these scripts on repeat and these patterns which are holding you back. And you cultivate a new, rehearsed narrative, the way that you think to yourself. And at the very least, you are not reacting to your old thoughts anymore in a way that controls your behaviors. Now, that brings us on to the fourth component, which is environment. At first principles, your environment refers to the external configuration of your social, physical, and digital cues that surround you and continuously feed evidence back into who you are. A cue, in this context, refers to a contextual trigger that prompts behavioral or psychological response. Mostly, this is happening non-consciously, but behind the curtain of your conscious awareness. You need to understand your environment that you exist in, the physical, social, and digital environment that you operate in on a daily basis is a museum of your past. It is littered with cues that are constantly encoding an old, outdated identity that no longer serves you. And so your old identity, doesn't matter how much behavior you try and change, is constantly encoding itself through your environment, through these hidden cues. And so you need to go through a process of destruction and cultivation. You know, there's a scene from Fight Club, and I guess this whole video is Fight Club coded because they do talk about this idea of self-destruction and transformation, where he detonates his apartment. The first stage to changing as a man is destroying your apartment. Now, I don't recommend you detonate your apartment, but you do want to radically change your surroundings to a large degree, destroying the cues that hold together your old self and cultivating new cues that support your new self. So through your social, physical, and digital environments, ask yourself the question, what would the version of me for whom my goals are inevitable, what environment would they exist in? And social is the people, the friends, the family, circles, the types of relationships you have. And most likely the version of you for whom your goal is inevitable, you're surrounding yourself around different people, or at least you're exposing yourselves to new people for whom the behaviors which you need to do are normalized and the minimum expectation. Physical environment, this is simple. This is where you're working, where you operate in. It has to be conducive. It has to make the actions easy and obvious. And this is basically the whole book of Atomic Habits, is engineering your physical environment. Next is your digital environment, which to a large degree people spend most of their day on. You need to engineer your digital environment in a way that doesn't bring back all of the old habits that represent your old self and cultivate new cues. Perhaps you put your phone on grayscale, or you permanently do not disturb, or whatever you want to do to reinforce a new version of yourself that represents this inevitable identity. Ultimately, the reframe here is detonation. As much change you can make as possible is the move, right? Even if that change isn't necessarily relevant to adding new cues, just reorganize your environment in a very radical way. That is the best approach here, because you just want to change things up, because that forces your brain to move, that forces your brain to shift from system 2, which is this sort of automatic, primal, limbic system, which is just operating on these patterns, into system 1, which is more forebrain focused. You activate your PFC, or prefrontal cortex, and it forces you to think. When you change your environment, it forces you to think about the environment and therefore the behaviors that you want to take, instead of running on these automatic grooves and loops which you've programmed in. And so again, operate from this question and spend a long time designing your environment, your social, your physical, and your digital environment. Do it once and it will serve you for the rest of your life, because your identity is constantly being encoded in the background, whether you realize it or not. And so that now brings us on to the fifth dimension of your identity, which we need to shift to undergo this process of self-destruction following the omnimorphic protocol. And that is your attention. Attention is the gatekeeper of your experienced reality. Attention at first principles refers to awareness concentrated on a specific component of reality. Right, we have a reality as a whole, and you have consciousness. You can look at your consciousness like the spotlight, and wherever that spotlight lands on, that is your attention. And so, as I mentioned earlier, every single second, you are unconsciously, your sensory channels are receiving about 11 million bits of information every single second through your eyes, vision, hearing, everything, all together. And there's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system, which I'm sure you've heard of before, and that is what is selecting what you actually notice, what actually reaches conscious awareness. Now, what's so remarkable here is how radical the filtering actually is. Out of those 11 million bits of information that you receive, you are only consciously aware of 50. You are experiencing maybe 0.0001% of the total sensory data that's coming in. You are experiencing a tiny sliver of what is actually going on in your reality. To a large degree, what you pay attention to is determining your subjective reality. Now, of course, what you subjectively experience determines what you subjectively feel, therefore what you think about, what you do, and then ultimately your results. To a large degree, it is your attention that determines much of everything else that happens in your life through your RAS. And so the direction in which this filtering goes is incredibly important, because if we're filtering out every single opportunity, if we're not noticing the opportunities to take action, or if we're constantly filtering things for the things that are going wrong or that represent our old life and that old identity, we're going to struggle. And so we need to modulate your attention if you want to stand any chance